the day I found out my husband had been lying to me. For 8 months, I was standing in a funeral home, holding a manila envelope full of documents I wasn't supposed to see, while his sister stood 10 feet away pretending she didn't know what was inside it. I was 34 years old. My father had died 6 days earlier, and the man I had been married to for 6 years was sitting in the front row of that funeral home, looking at the floor like the ground might swallow him whole if he stared hard enough. I remember thinking, something is wrong, not with the grief. Grief made sense. My father was gone, and I was hollowed out in the way you only understand if you've lost a parent. But there was something else sitting in that room with us. Something cold that had nothing to do with death. I just didn't know what it was yet. My name is Evelyn. I'm from a small city in Ohio, the kind of place where everyone knows your family and your family's history and the story of your family's house. My father, whose name was Raymond, built a furniture business from nothing over 40 years, started with a small workshop in our garage when I was 5 years old. By the time I was in high school, he had a showroom on the east side of town and 12 employees. By the time I graduated college, the business had a second location and a name people in our county actually recognized. He never got rich, but he built something. And he was proud of it every single day. I married my husband 6 years ago. We met at a work conference in Columbus, fell into something fast and real, and got married 18 months later in my parents' backyard. He was charming in the way that felt genuine back then. Funny, good with people. My mother loved him immediately. My father warmed up slowly, the way he did with most people, but eventually he came around. He told me once, about 2 years into the marriage, that he thought I'd done well for myself. Coming from my father, that was a significant thing to say. What I didn't know, and wouldn't know for a long time, was that my husband had been spending the last year and a half quietly inserting himself into my father's business affairs. Not visibly. Not in any way I could see. He didn't work there. He didn't attend meetings. He just offered to help with paperwork here and there when my father's health started declining. Ran some numbers. Reviewed some vendor contracts. Small things that seemed considerate. My father was in his late 60s and had a bad knee and got tired more easily than he used to. Having someone step in felt like family taking care of family. That's what I thought it was. When my father died of a heart attack on a Tuesday evening in November, the grief was immediate and total. There is nothing that prepares you for the death of a parent, even when you know it's coming, and with my father, it wasn't even coming. He was there, and then he wasn't. I remember getting the call from my mother, and I remember my legs not working right, and I remember my husband driving us to the hospital while I sat in the passenger seat, absolutely unable to speak. He held my hand the whole way there. I think about that now, the fact that he held my hand, and I don't know what to do with it. The days after were the standard chaos of loss. Arrangements, phone calls, family arriving from out of state. My mother moving through the house like she was underwater, which is what I'd always heard about grief and which I now understood completely. I tried to hold things together for her while also falling apart privately, in bathrooms, in the car, in the 10 minutes before sleep, when there was nothing left to distract me. My husband was helpful. He made calls. He coordinated with the funeral home. He picked up relatives from the airport. I noticed dimly that he was also spending a lot of time on the phone with someone I didn't know, but I assumed it was work. I assumed everything was work. I wasn't paying close attention to anything except the fact that my father was gone. The envelope arrived at my mother's house 3 days after the funeral. It came through a local attorney's office, addressed to me specifically. Inside were financial documents related to my father's business. Tax records, vendor agreements, account statements going back 14 months. A handwritten note from the attorney said only, "These were removed from the business files and set aside for safekeeping. I believe you should see them before the estate proceedings begin." I had no idea what that meant. I took the envelope to the dining room table and started reading. And then I stopped. And then I started again, because I must have been misunderstanding something. The numbers weren't adding up. A vendor account I didn't recognize. Payments made to an LLC that I couldn't find any record of. Transfer authorizations signed by my father, but dated during the months when his health had been at its worst, when he was on medication that affected his focus and his memory. He'd mentioned that himself. He'd laughed about it, actually, called himself foggy. He wasn't laughing about it in these documents. He was signing things. I sat there for a long time. Then I called my husband into the room. He came in carrying a mug of coffee and looked at the papers on the table, and something crossed his face so quickly, I almost didn't catch it. If I hadn't been watching him specifically in that moment, I would have missed it entirely. It was there for maybe half a second. A kind of calculation, like a person briefly running through options before deciding which face to wear. Then he said, "What's all this?" I told him about the envelope. I told him about the attorney's note. I pushed the papers toward him and watched him pick them up and look at them with the careful expression of someone performing confusion. "I don't know what these are," he said. "Do you recognize this LLC?" I asked. I pointed to the name on one of the transfer authorizations. He looked at it for a moment. "No! You're sure?" "Of course I'm sure." He put the papers down, kissed the top of my head, told me not to spiral right now, told me I was exhausted from grief and that everything would get sorted out with the estate attorney when the time was right. He took his coffee and went back into the living room, and I sat there alone at that table, looking at those documents and feeling something I couldn't quite name yet. It wasn't grief. I already knew what grief felt like. This was something different. Something quieter and sharper at the same time. I didn't say anything else that night. But I took photographs of every page in that envelope before I put it back. The estate process began the following week. My father hadn't had a complicated will. The business was to be split between my mother and me, with my mother having operational control during her lifetime. Standard. He'd set it up years ago with the same local attorney who had been handling his affairs for decades. What wasn't standard was that several accounts were lower than they should have been. The estate attorney, a steady, careful woman named, she'd been practicing in our county for 30 years, explained this to my mother and me across a conference table, covered in folders. She said the discrepancies were being reviewed. She said she wanted to understand the recent transactions before they proceeded. She looked at me when she said this. Not at my mother, at me. I looked back at her and said, "Did anyone else have access to these accounts in the past year?" She paused. Then she said, "That's what we're trying to determine." I went home and I did not tell my husband about that conversation. I started paying attention differently after that. Quietly, the way you do when you're not ready to know something fully, but your body already knows it and is preparing you in small increments. I noticed that my husband had a second phone. I'd seen it before and accepted the explanation. A work device, he'd said. But now I noticed when he used it and when he didn't, and the pattern wasn't consistent with work. I noticed that his sister, who had always been pleasant but a little distant with me, was calling him more frequently. Their conversations were short, and they always happened when he stepped outside or went to another room. I noticed that he was careful around documents. Any paper having to do with my father's estate, any envelope from an attorney, anything I left out on the kitchen counter. He picked it up, looked at it, sometimes moved it. I started keeping copies of everything. 3 weeks after my father's death, I went to see the estate attorney alone. I brought the photographs I had taken of the original documents. I laid them on her desk. She looked at them for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "Where did you get these?" I told her about the envelope. She said, "I need to make some calls." Whatever those calls were, what came back was not small. The LLC in the documents was real. It had been registered 11 months earlier in a state 3 time zones away. The registered agent was a name I didn't recognize. But when the attorney's investigator traced the account that received the transfers, the trail eventually connected to a second account, and that second account had a co-signer. My husband's sister. I want to explain something about that moment. Because it wasn't like the movies where everything clicks into place at once, and you feel some clean, clarifying anger. It was messier than that. It was the specific nausea of realizing that something you accepted as safe was not safe. That a hand you held was connected to something you didn't understand. That the people sitting in the front row at your father's funeral, looking sad, were sitting there knowing things you didn't know. I drove home. I made dinner. I watched my husband eat and talk about something he'd seen on the news, and I sat across from him and said almost nothing, and he didn't notice. That was the part I kept coming back to later. He didn't notice. The estate attorney contacted the county probate court. A hearing was scheduled. It was framed as a routine estate matter, which legally it was, but it was not routine. There were additional parties involved now. There were questions about financial authorization. There were documents subpoenaed. My husband was informed. And that was when things changed. He became gentle with me in a way that felt constructed. Extra considerate. He started asking how I was doing more than he normally would. Brought me coffee in the morning without being asked. Suggested we take a weekend trip somewhere quiet. I said I wasn't ready for that. I was still in the middle of grieving, I said. He said of course. He said he understood. He didn't ask about the estate hearing. That was the thing I noticed. Anyone who had nothing to hide would have asked. The morning of the hearing, I got dressed alone. My husband said he'd come with me for support. I said it wasn't necessary. He said he wanted to be there. I said fine. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Wood paneling, fluorescent lights, a judge who looked like she had heard every possible variation of human disappointment and had made her peace with it. My mother sat beside me. The estate attorney sat on my other side. Across the table, there was a representative from the probate office and two people I didn't know. Likely hired by the other side, I assumed. My husband sat in the gallery behind me. His sister did not come. The proceedings began quietly. Documents were entered. The attorney made her statements. The judge reviewed pages and asked questions, and the room had the particular flatness of legal process, where everything important is said in measured, careful language that makes catastrophe sound like administration. And then my husband's name came up. Not as a witness, not as a party, as a signatory on an account disbursement that had occurred 9 months earlier. I turned around. He was looking at the table in front of him. Not at me, at the table. I had spent weeks preparing for this moment. I had told myself I was ready. I was not ready. The specific feeling of looking at the person you married and realizing the shape of what they did. It doesn't matter how much you prepare. The bottom still drops out. The judge asked the estate attorney to clarify the chain of authorization. My attorney walked through it, steadily and without drama. My father had signed documents during a period when his physician had formally noted cognitive impacts from his medication. The documents transferred a portion of business funds, just over $180,000, through a vendor account that did not correspond to any actual vendor. The LLC that received those funds had been registered months before my father's health declined. It had been set up in anticipation. That was the word the attorney used. Anticipation. The room was quiet. The judge looked up from the documents. She looked at the table where the opposing representatives were sitting. She said, "Are either of you prepared to offer an explanation for the timeline?" Neither of them said anything. And then from the back of the room, I heard a voice. It was a man's voice, older, and it was shaking slightly. The way voices shake when someone has been holding something back for a very long time. I turned around. Standing just inside the courtroom door was a man I recognized from one family gathering years ago. My husband's uncle, a quiet, heavy man who had always seemed uncomfortable in social situations. He was holding a folder. He said, "Your Honor, I need to say something." The judge looked at him. The bailiff moved toward him. He held up one hand and said, "I have documentation." And then he walked to the front of the room. What he said, quietly and without theatrics, was this. His niece, my husband's sister, had approached him 14 months ago and asked him to co-sign on a business registration. She told him it was a consulting company she was starting. She told him it was legitimate. He signed. He didn't ask enough questions. When he figured out what the company had actually been used for, he went to an attorney of his own. And his attorney told him he needed to come forward. He put the folder on the judge's table. I watched my husband from the corner of my eye. He had gone very still. The judge reviewed what was in the folder. She reviewed it for a long time. The courtroom was entirely silent except for the hum of the ventilation system and the occasional sound of someone shifting in their seat. Then she said, "I'm ordering a full forensic accounting of the estate assets. This hearing is adjourned pending investigation." She looked at the representative for the opposing side and said, "I would strongly advise your clients to cooperate." Then she stood and left the room. For several seconds, no one moved. My mother reached over and took my hand. Her grip was stronger than I expected. I turned around slowly. My husband was standing up. He was looking at me now, finally. And the expression on his face was not the face of someone who had been falsely accused. It was the face of someone who had been caught. I walked out of that courtroom with my mother and my attorney, and I did not speak to my husband. In the hallway, the attorney told us what came next. The investigation would take time. The probate court would freeze the contested assets. There would likely be criminal referrals. She said these things in the same measured voice she had used inside. And I stood there nodding, and somewhere in the background I could hear my husband saying my name. I didn't turn around. The weeks that followed were the hardest I'd ever lived through. And I want to be honest about that because I think people expect a clean ending to a story like this. They expect some moment of triumph that cancels out everything that came before it. That's not what happened. What happened was a long, grinding process of legal proceedings and phone calls and meetings with attorneys and conversations with my mother about what the business might look like going forward. What happened was a divorce filing that I initiated and that my husband did not contest. What happened was the slow, exhausting work of finding out the full extent of what had been done. Not just the money, though the money was significant, but the relationship, the access. The months of watching someone use your grief and your trust as a doorway into your family. My husband's sister was charged. The uncle who came forward that day in the courtroom cooperated fully with investigators. My husband cooperated too, eventually, in the way people cooperate when cooperation is the only remaining option. His involvement was more complicated than simple theft. He had known what his sister was doing, and he had not stopped it. And he had not told me. Whether that made him a criminal in the legal sense was something for the courts to determine. Whether it made him someone I could ever trust again was not complicated at all. I don't need to tell you the answer. What I want to tell you, instead, is about something that happened about 4 months after the courtroom. I was at my mother's house, helping her sort through my father's workshop. It was a Saturday in early spring, and the light was coming through the small windows in the way it does. That time of year, dusty and pale and somehow kind. My mother was going through a cabinet of hardware, and I was going through a stack of old business files. At the bottom of the stack, I found a notebook. My father's handwriting, notes from the early years of the business, supplier contacts, price estimates, sketches of furniture designs that never got made. And on the last page, in different ink, like he'd come back to it later, a single sentence. The people who deserve your trust will never have to ask for it twice. I don't know when he wrote it. I don't know if it was meant for anyone specifically or just a thought he had one afternoon that he wanted to keep. But I stood there in that workshop, holding that notebook, and I let myself cry in a way I hadn't let myself cry since the funeral. Not just for my father. For the version of my life I had believed in. For the years I'd spent building something with someone who was always calculating what he could take from it. For the grief that was already enormous before I knew any of this. And that became something heavier and more complicated once I did. There are days when I still pick up my phone to tell my father something. That reflex doesn't go away quickly. He would have known, I think. He would have seen what was happening before I did. He was slower to trust than I was, and I used to tease him about that. I don't anymore. The business is still operating. My mother decided she wanted to keep it running, at least for now, and she brought in a manager to help her. Some of the employees have been there for over a decade. They knew my father. They showed up at the funeral. When the investigation became public in our small city, the way everything eventually does, they stayed. That meant something. The money that was recovered, and some of it was recovered, though not all, went back into the estate. The legal process was long and not entirely satisfying, and the way the law handles these things does not always match the way justice feels. But my mother got to keep the business. The name is still on the saw sign. My father built it from a workshop in a garage, and it is still there. I am not the person I was before this happened. I mean that in both directions. I lost something. An ease, a willingness to accept what people tell me without the small question underneath. But I also found out something about myself that I wouldn't have known otherwise. I can stand up in rooms that terrify me. I can sit across the table from someone who betrayed me and not look away. I can grieve and fight at the same time, which turns out to be something very few people know they're capable of until they have to be. I moved back to Ohio. I'm renting a house about 12 minutes from my mother's. On Sundays we have dinner together. And sometimes we talk about my father, and sometimes we don't, and both feel right. I kept the notebook. There's a line my father wrote on the first page. A different day, different ink again. That I didn't notice until I'd had the notebook for a few weeks. It says, slow down enough to see who's actually in the room. He wasn't a man who said big things. He built furniture. He kept his word. He came home every night. But the things he wrote down, when he wrote anything at all, had a way of landing exactly where they needed to. Some truth doesn't come loudly. It doesn't arrive with a dramatic gesture or an outburst in a crowded room. Sometimes it comes quietly, in a workshop on a Saturday morning, in handwriting you would recognize anywhere, in words that feel like they were written just for you. And once you see it clearly, you realize you already knew. Somewhere underneath everything, underneath the shock and the grief and the years of believing in something that turned out to be different than you thought, you already knew. You just needed the room to go quiet enough to hear it.